Hello, everyone. I have something else for you today. I'm going to join the those people who are talking about the USAID, but I'm going to give it a different. This is what I want to share with you. I have been listening to Latin American sources because in the West here, we all heard the news of what is happening and the revelations, and we are all kind of hearing the same examples. I thought that since in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was so many problems, so much trouble, political problems in Latin America, whether they would be talking about examples that we are not hearing here in the West, just to see what they were saying there. Also, my goodness, the things I heard, I ended up not knowing whether to go to a psychiatrist and pay for a psychiatrist. I said at the end, I said, no, I think I'll do a podcast instead, cheaper. And perhaps one of you will buy me a coffee, by the way. Welcome. Okay. Now, it's just that, you see, there is so much going on that we've gone from a president that could hardly talk to a president who doesn't stop talking. And we can't even go to sleep. I mean, there is so much going on. In any case, this USAID with Elon Musk and Musk. Okay. Just to give you an idea of what I have been hearing, I'll give you a few examples, but one of them, in Peru, in the 1970s, already functioning there, 300,000 indigenous Indian women were sterilized. 300,000. These are the kind of things that I have been listening to, but I'll just give you. Okay, so let me start. Adding nothing new to what you're hearing for the time being as an introduction, but nevertheless setting the stage. Okay, so yes, it was created in order to give humanitarian aid, but it had also a different role, as we know. It was to help in natural catastrophes, humanitarian crises, and we all saw many times in humanitarian crisis actually the containers with humanitarian aid with that symbol of the crossed hands and the bars and stripes of the American flag. This was the origin for which it was created. But the Latin Americans are saying, of course, they're used to coups and false flags and so on. So they are a little bit more, saying, yeah, well, I mean, is anyone surprised? That kind of attitude. But what they're saying is that it's not that the origin was so great and then with time degenerated. They don't accept that. They say that it had a double meaning there, the agency, a double role from the very beginning. That it was also born out of a geopolitical objective, very clear. And because he had that geopolitical objective from the beginning, that second part of it, I will explain it better in a second. The second part of it was the one side that degenerated and took the agency to where it took it, to where it was today, to a few days ago. A little bit of the history of what I'm hearing from them is that at the end of the 50s, with that impulse for development that It had already occurred during the Marshall Plan, after the war, and other aid. This whole vision of developmental aid got the support of John Kennedy in 1957, and that was before he became president. Before becoming president, he proposed the creation of an office of foreign aid that would promote American economic support. It first went to India, and then it extended throughout the world. In 1961, the president created the Peace Corps, as you know, through an executive order in March 21, just a month and a half after the inauguration. On March 22nd, he sent a special message to Congress on foreign aid, stating that the decade of the 60s would be a decade of development, proposing to unify U.S. development aid into one single agency. And this agency was to be USAID. It took shape in that same year, in 1961. But it was from the very beginning, nevertheless, not just an office for the developmental aid, humanitarian aid to poor countries. These agencies usually have a double mission at least. And in this case, it certainly had two, although both of them were not specified in their website. The aid was to be given or directed towards strategic countries, not to all countries who were poor in need of development. No, strategic countries. Who were those strategic countries? Well, if you remember, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of insurrection in countries throughout Europe and certainly throughout Latin America. And its mission, the mission of the agency in these strategic areas, was to prevent the advance of communist forces or revolutionary forces in these countries, to avoid that they would be in a position to actually take power. These revolutionary forces, because there was so much discontent, there was so much, the economic situation was so bad, the dictatorships were so obvious, people were unhappy, and so they would join these revolutionary movements. Okay, so they decided to help out in given aid so as to, for sure, bring down the tensions, and demobilize at the same time these revolutionary groups who sometimes get very, very close to power. That was one mission. The other covert mission, really, was to, especially during the 60s, which was not advertised, was to actually be an entry door, a pathway to open new markets for American corporations. From the very beginning, the USAID became an organization dependent on the whole security and intelligence structure of the US. In fact, from the very beginning, the director was Byron Engel, a CIA man. You can check him out. It's there in the internet. Let me see if, hold on a second. I'll show you something here. If I can share this Byron, do you see this letter from him, April 10th, 1957? addressed to the Central Intelligence Agency, 2430 E Street, Northwest Washington. Attention. Enclosed herewith is an additional copy of the report on the national police in the Republic of El Salvador, requested by you this date. If additional copies are required, please let us know. Sincerely yours, Byron Engel, Chief Civil Police Administration Division. Okay. So, so what they do, actually, from the very beginning, there was this relationship was renewed year after year. Every year it had to be renewed. In 2015, Obama actually simply just appointed the director of the National Security Council, the White House, named her the director of the agency. Some of you may remember the name of Samantha Powers, also related to the entire sort of American intelligence structure. So what did they do? A few examples. What did this agency do? First, method. They would choose a suitable strategic country for a project prepared by the Secretary of State office. It didn't, of course, have to be the most needy or the poorest country, but a country in which the US had strategic interests. Yeah. Then they would decide on the sector to be used, to be involved in some aid. It could be security, it could be agriculture, it could be technology. And when both the country and the sector were decided, then they were ready to enter into the country through an NGO. Okay, they would be given entry, and so they could act. It had its own covert interests, obviously. The sector would be in many cases, the front, as it were. Don't know whether we are being, overly, overdoing it, really. But I don't think so. They entered through a sector. Okay. So, for example, in Iraq, the obvious example, they mention it in Latin America too, as they give it as an example. After the American invasion, this liberal economic view of the world is practically injected into its veins. And massive, massive privatizations of the economy are imposed, including the oil industry, which Saddam Hussein had nationalized. Then this agency, the agency, also forced the new rulers of Iraq to buy transgenic grains from Monsanto. What for? Transgenic? Well, so that Iraqi farmers really would be enslaved to the corporation. Because, as you all know, the seeds of transgenic grains are not good for the following year. They are kind of sterile, okay? So, which means that next year, you have to again buy seeds from Monsanto. Okay, so this was American corporations were given entry, the privatization of the oil industry, and also, and many other things, forcing the agricultural sector to buy their seeds. Yes, we all know Saddam Hussein, a dictator, terrible person, and so on, but nevertheless, the problem was that he nationalized the oil especially. And once you nationalize it, at least in theory, belongs to the country. Another example, Peru. I said before in the 1970s, no, it was in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the agency gave, actually in 1990, the agency gave $35 million to the electoral campaign of Alberto Fujimori, a man of Japanese descent, who, I remember, whose economic measures actually plunged the country into misery, absolute misery. I do remember. What did Fujimori do? What was the collateral required for that help to get him into power? Because he came from nowhere. It has been happening for decades. This all of a sudden someone appears from nowhere, and lo and behold, they win the election. They have the support of the media. They have the support. Okay, he was one of them. Appeared from nowhere, won. What did he do? What was the collateral for his help, for this help that he received? Well, in order to reduce poverty in Peru, and in a grand experiment worthy of unforgettable and unforgivable concentration camps, forcibly sterilized 300,000 indigenous women, Native American women in Peru, forcibly sterilized 300,000 indigenous women. This is a crime. Let me see if I can give you a little bit more about Fujimori. Because my goodness, this guy. This is, I hope you can see it. This is from the BBC News. Because he died, I think he died a year ago. Right? Anyway, Alberto Fujimori profiled deeply divisive Peruvian leader. Here he is in his, not long ago, obviously. To his supporters, Alberto Fujimori was the president who saved Peru from the twin evils of terrorism and economic collapse. To his opponents, he was an authoritarian strongman who rode roughshod over the country's democratic institutions in order to preserve his hold on power. The son of Japanese immigrants, Mr. Fujimori's decade in power from 1990 to 2000, in which he ruled with an iron fist, was marked by a series of dramatic twists and turns. His authoritarian government's crackdown on two violent insurgencies during his tenure resulted in the death squads of an estimated 69,000 people. Several years after his presidency ended, Mr. Fujimori was found guilty of bribery and abuse of power and was sentenced to 25 years in prison for human rights abuses during his time in office, including authorizing a number of killings carried out by death squads. I remember those. Sentenced to 25 years in prison in 2009 at the age of 70, most Peruvians assumed the former leader would spend the rest of his life in jail. But in December 2017, the 79-year-old was taken from prison to a hospital in the capital, Lima, because of health concerns. he was suffering from low blood pressure and abnormal heart rhythm. That same month, Mr. Fujimori was granted a pardon by President Pedro Pablo Kuczynski after doctors said his illness was incurable, adding that prison represented a grave risk to his life. In response, Mr. Fujimori said he was deeply grateful and that while his leadership was well received by some, he recognized that he had let down others, adding, "Those I ask for forgiveness from the bottom of my heart." He also called for the country to unite against crime and violence. "We'll be in a country in which security is regained and violence eliminated," he tweeted. Well, that was very nice. So the president's iron fist here, one of the key elements of his presidency was the hostage siege by Marxist rebels belonging to the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, which occurred at the Japanese ambassador's residence in Lima in 1996-97. After a 4-month standoff, commandos were sent in to take the building. All 14 rebels were killed and nearly all the 72 hostages were rescued in an operation that at the time cemented Mr. Fujimori's talking and acting tough. The president's reputation was later tarnished by a bribery scandal involving former intelligence chief. Okay, it goes on to other more things, but I want to see at the end, Mr. Fujimori, then, he, in an effort, hold on. The president's reputation was later tarnished by a bribery scandal involving former intelligence chief Vladimiro Montesinos, which led to him fleeing to his parents' native Japan in November 2000, where he lived for 5 years in self-imposed exile. But he couldn't leave well enough alone, and so in an effort to resurrect his political career and launch a new bid for the presidency, he flew to Chile in November 2005, only to be arrested at the request of the Peruvian authorities. Mr. Fujimori then spent 2 years fighting to block his extradition to face a series of charges, a battle he lost in September 2007. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in jail in 2007 on charges of abuse of power over the removal of sensitive video and audio tapes from Mr. Montesinos' home. But in April 2009, judges found him guilty of authorizing death squad's killing in 2 incidents known as La Cantuta and Barrios Altos, and the kidnapping of a journalist and a businessman. Mr. Fujimori repeatedly denied the charges, saying they were politically motivated. And just to end, Mr. Fujimori's 15-month trial and the divisions in public opinion it generated echoed the controversy that accompanied him throughout his political career. When he won the presidential elections in 1990, few Peruvians knew what to expect. An agricultural engineer born of Japanese parents, Mr. Fujimori was a political unknown until weeks before the vote. He inherited a country on the verge of economic collapse and racked by political violence. He implemented a radical program of free market reforms, removing subsidies, privatizing state-owned companies, and reducing the role of the state in almost all spheres of the economy. It's happening again in Argentina now. Though this shock therapy brought great hardship for ordinary Peruvians, it ended rampant hyperinflation and paved the way for sustained economic growth in the second half of the 1990s. Mr. Fujimori also tackled the left-wing rebels whose 10-year insurgency had caused thousands of deaths. But he says he never approved a dirty war against the rebels. In 1992, with the support of the military, the president dissolved, that is 2 years after he won the election, the president dissolved the Peruvian Congress and courts and seized dictatorial powers. He justified the measure by arguing that the legislative and judiciary had been hindering the security forces in their fight against the rebels, and so on. Okay. So that gives you an idea of corruption and so on. Goodness. Another example, India, in exchange for aid, they implemented the very, very quickly, it was like tsunami. People were unprepared at the time, the digitalization of the economy, forcing tens of millions of Indians, especially the poor and the most disadvantaged classes, to have to abandon completely payments in cash and change it to digital. How? Well, with cards, the usual at the time, credit cards, before debit cards, credit cards, MasterCard and Visa, you remember. And they entered like a tsunami in India to make safe business, since they actually forced millions of people to have to do their financial transactions only through the cards of 2 corporations. The Gates Foundation was also involved in this indirectly in exchange for a check given to the World Health Organization, and so on. Uruguay, the case of Dan Mitrone, the director of USAID at the time. Let me, again, if I can share this from Uruguay. To save Dan Mitrone, I don't know whether any of you from the 70s remember this case. To save Dan Mitrone, he is the director of USAID. The Nixon administration urged death threats for Uruguayan prisoners. In response, Uruguayan security forces launched death squads to hunt and kill insurgents. Here we have President Nixon, Secretary of State William Rogers, U.S. Ambassador to Uruguay, Charles Adair, and Uruguayan Foreign Minister Jorge Peirano. Let me read you this because you might not have heard of it. Remember that in those times in Latin America, you normally had dictators, then there was a movement to get rid of the dictator, and invariably, of course, the United States would say these are communist, so in order to, they would help the dictator or install another dictator. You know the story. Let me read you this. Washington, D.C., August 11th, 2010. Documents posted by the National Security Archive on the 40th anniversary of the death of U.S. advisor Dan Mitrione in Uruguay show the Nixon administration recommended a threat to kill the detained insurgent Sendik and other key leftist insurgents, the MLN prisoners, if Mitrone is killed. The secret cable from US Secretary of State William Rogers, made public here for the first time, instructed US Ambassador Charles Adair, if this, quote, if this has not been considered, you should raise it with the government of Uruguay at once. This was going to, the situation was bad enough, okay? But the answer would be death squads all over the place. So let me continue. The message to the Uruguayan government received by the US Embassy at 11:30 a.m. on August 9th, 1970, was an attempt to deter Tupamaro insurgents from killing Mitrione at noon on that day. A few minutes later, Ambassador Adair reported back in another newly released cable that a threat was made to these prisoners that members of the death squads would take action against the prisoners' relatives if Mitrone were killed. Fine, so we have a standoff there, okay? Dan Mitrione, director of the USAID Office of Public Safety, OPS, in Uruguay, and the main American advisor to the Uruguayan police at the time, had been held for 10 days by the MLN Tupamaro insurgents, demanding the release of some 150 guerrilla prisoners held by the Uruguayan government. Mitrione was found dead. They actually killed him at the end. He was found dead the morning of August 10th, 1970, killed by the Tupamaros after their demands were not met. Quote, the documents revealed the United States went to the edge of ethics in an effort to save Mitrione, an aspect of the case that remained hidden in secret documents for years, said Carlos Osorio, who directs the National Security Archives Southern Cone Project. There should be a full declassification to set the record straight on U.S. policy to Uruguay in the 1960s and 70s. Quote, in the aftermath of Dan Mitrione's death, the Uruguayan government unleashed the illegal death squads to hunt and kill insurgents, said Clara Aldrigui, professor of history at Uruguay's Universidad de la República and author of El Caso Mitrione, the Mitrione case. Quote, the US documents are irrefutable proof that the death squads were a policy of the Uruguayan government and will serve as key evidence in the death squad cases open now in Uruguay's courts, Osorio said. It is a shame that the US documents are writing Uruguayan history. There should be declassification in Uruguay as well, end of quote, stated Aldrigui, who collaborated in the production of this briefing book. Uruguay, with a long-standing, until then, democratic tradition, entered a crisis during most of the 60s and 70s. I don't know why people put that apostrophe there when they write about decades. It's supposed to be a plural. It doesn't have to have the little thingy there. 1960 0S. Oh, anyway, it upsets me. Anyway, it entered a crisis during the 1960s and 70s. The US government feared the strongest Latin American insurgency at the time, the leftist Movimiento Nacional de Liberación, the MLN Tupamaros. They feared that they would topple a weak Uruguayan government, so they therefore supported the Uruguayan government with economic and security assistance. The USAID Office of Public Safety helped enhance the counterinsurgency techniques of a Uruguayan police renowned for the wide use of torture among prisoners. Under Dan Mitrione, that's the guy, the OPS consolidated the Uruguayan Police National Directorate for Information and Intelligence. It was right at this time that the Tupamaro insurgents kidnapped Mitrione on July the 31st, 1970, and demanded the release of 150 Tupamaro prisoners. During the 10 days Mitrione was kidnapped, the US went to great lengths to secure his release, obviously. Nixon administration officials pressured the Uruguayan government to negotiate, offer ransom, and, in the words of President Nixon himself, quote, spare no effort to secure the safe return of Mr. Mitrione. Dan Mitrione was a policeman, had been a policeman, from Richmond, Indiana, who later became an FBI agent. In the mid-1960s, he was hired by the USAID Office of Public Safety to train policemen in Brazil and Uruguay. He was the one who referred to torture. It was actually torture as the advanced interrogation technique, if you have heard that. Okay. According to A.J. Languth in his book Hidden Terrors in Uruguay, as the US trained officers came to occupy key positions in the police, the claims of torture grew. Languth believed Mitrione taught torture to Uruguayan officers. Mitrione's activities inspired filmmaker Costa Gavras for his film Stage of Siege, which portrays the US support for a dictatorial government and the widespread use of torture by security forces in Uruguay. The 9 documents posted today by the National Security Archive contain evidence that the government of Uruguay unleashed death squad's activity in the wake of Mitrione's execution, and that the United States was aware of these extrajudicial operations. While further declassification is needed to fully comprehend the development of death squad's activities in Uruguay, the release of these documents is an important step in advancing international understanding of the Mitrione case and this chapter of US and Uruguayan history. Okay, so you see the situation in the 70s, okay? But it is a fact, they were talking about it, that he was teaching courses in the 70s on the complex art of advanced interrogation. If you ever wonder what these tortures are like, back in the 70s, after the coup in Chile, I met a Chilean woman who had been here in England, who had been tortured in prison. And she had a very, she walked with a limp, very, very heavy. She didn't have that before, but it was because of the culture, the torture. And she would walk like this. It was really pronounced. And I was young then, and I knew she had been tortured. She told me she didn't want to talk about it too much, but one day I insisted. And you cannot imagine the types of things that they do, and to women, especially sexual things. I'm talking about chickens and all kinds of weird things. It's horrific. Anyway, so he was teaching courses in the 70s on the complex art of advanced interrogation. They kidnapped him, they killed him. All right, that's not how you solve problems. But then because of that, there was death squads all over the country. It was absolutely horrid. And even more, well, not more, but equally horrid is that when they ran out of detainees, of the insurgents, and this is documented, they used to teach torture. They used other human beings as guinea pigs, the homeless and poor men and women in Uruguay, as examples. That's another crime. Anyway, needless to say, USAID was also at the same time creating thousands of jobs in American NGOs, which in exchange for donations, these are what the Latin Americans are saying, serve the interest of obviously their donors. And here we could mention very well-known humanitarians such as Rockefeller, the Soros, the Gates, the Ford Foundation, the Omidyar group. Oh, what is the Omidyar group? Well, let me show you. Let me give you an example of, let me see. This is the Omidyar group, okay? Omidyar group, okay? So you see a lot of people here, probably in India, I'm not sure, but in any case, okay, sowing, planting, okay, empowering people around the world, founded by Pierre and Pam Omidyar. The Omidyar Group is a diverse collection of companies, organizations, and initiatives, each guided by its own approach, but all united by a common desire to catalyze social impact. We believe in progress, not perfection. Our approach is grounded in the Omidyar's belief that we are all part of a global community and that the impact of our individual choices reaches far beyond our own lives. When these choices are positive, we believe they foster a thriving world where people are free to act on their inherent capabilities and are supported by institutions that are accountable, responsive, and just. We cultivate our work through 4 focus areas: courageous leadership, good governance, informed and engaged citizens, thriving communities. Okay. Now, these to open markets to the North American corporations, where all these gentlemen had their interests, whether because they were representatives of investment funds or directly participants in the shareholding of many of these corporations, these were given entry. The USAID themselves so that you know, they themselves actually boasted of the fact that they returned to the United States, or to the United States corporations, 80% of the money that they had invested. So what aid was that? In other words, you sent 1 million in this aid, okay, and I'll give you back $800,000. Okay, you give 1 million, we'll send you back $800,000, and in exchange, really, the aid that you're giving is 20%. Yeah, but for that 20%, you as a country are really enslaving yourselves, submitting yourselves, subjugating yourselves to the American corporations. This became so obvious that they, what they were doing now, it was more and more obvious. And so a lot of countries actually expelled this agency. Russia expelled it in 2012. Putin did. So Putin came in 2000. So for 12 years, they were in Russia, probably creating chaos. Anyway, they were also expelled from other some Latin American countries, the ones that call themselves the Bolivar alternative of the Americans. These are countries like Bolivia, Cuba, Ecuador, Dominica, Nicaragua, Venezuela. In Africa also, Burkina Faso. There were quite a few countries that actually expelled this agency. The last example in Cuba, Cuba has been there, oh my goodness, since the late 50s, right? Okay, but in 2010, the agency introduced in Cuba through there is a song contest in Latin America. If you it's the equivalent of the Eurovision Song Contest. Okay, so all these countries will participate, and they'll sing a song, and it's a contest. Okay, so Cuba was taking part. It's been going on since the early 70s, I think. So in 2010, the agency introduced in Cuba through this singing contest called the OTI, a messaging system. This is in 2010, equivalent to that, similar to that of Twitter at the time. And they call this system Sunsuneo, okay. And it was used actually to collect personal data of hundreds of thousands of Cubans, especially young Cubans, who entered there, in order to vote, or in order to comment, or in order to whatever it was that they were doing, the singing of songs and so on, music. Because the agency sponsored a whole series of rappers, actually, people in famous people for them, I suppose, who were used as a hook, to get personal data of hundreds of thousands of young Cubans. And so we start a sort of a dissident movement again, the color revolution things, okay, in the network. Encouraging people to go out into the street and protest. And sure enough, after 2010, protests in the streets started. It originated there. So now Trump and Elon Musk, I understand that it is all this inside the United States, question of perhaps internal politics. But I nevertheless think that for those of us, for countries outside of the United States, to actually have it evidence in this manner, I think is a great help. So if for nothing else, I would like to thank President Trump and Elon Musk for this. Because first, many of the problems that the world has suffered and has been suffering, and problems that we have been enduring now for many years, many decades, is because of this interference. But also it helps us a little better to understand what is happening now. Oh, yes, I have another example here. So anyway, I think I am grateful because they have brought to light all this rot, really, all this infamous swamp, which under the shell of aid and development, what they hid below, it was really an American geopolitical corporate interests, because we keep saying the same thing. The people of the United States didn't benefit. Right? The corruption of business, the corruption of the countries to which they send the aid to. They were already corrupt, otherwise they wouldn't have sold their country for money or sold their souls. But this didn't help. All you had to whisper, they're saying, well, you have to whisper with these corrupt politicians that we have to endure in our countries, was just to say $2,000. I mean, they were, just exaggerating, but that is what they're talking about. Another example that they mentioned, by the way, the media is trying to cover all this, but not really so much. I mean, they're talking about it, but they talk about some scandals, but they're trying to cover quite a few very, very important ones. For example, to hide things like the $53 million that USAID invested in the organization EcoHealth Alliance. Who are they? The ones that were carrying out the research of the gain of function experiments on, diseases and things in the Chinese lab. Yeah. It was not the only one, but was one of the investors who financed all those experiments that now even I hope I won't get into trouble with YouTube, even the CIA itself recognizes that it was a leak. The Chinese, the lab, was a lab that was probably rented out of Johns Hopkins University, Fauci and et al., US Department of Health. There were many companies, many experiments that by accident or whatever happened, a little thingy escaped from a lab. But this is not at all funny, because that little thingy thing, there we're told, millions of deaths because of it. And if that is the case, this is enough to take all those responsible to an international tribunal. It won't happen. International courts doesn't work. But it is really, if you think about it, if this is the case, it's one of the most horrid criminal actions in modern times, because many millions died, millions of ruined families too, millions of people who have been left with serious side effects, millions of people who were injected with something known also to affect, they say, the immune system, among other things. Suffering also many people from side effects. Some people have died because of the side effects. Now we know that EcoHealth Alliance was helping with these experiments. From 2019, USAID, through Lavidin Ukraine, which is a branch of Lavidin Global Health, which is an American company whose founders were previously in another firm called Metaviota, the main contractor of bacteriological weapons of the Pentagon, devoted themselves to having these labs in the Ukraine. You remember when the war started that the Russians found across the border about 29 labs there. This is not new. Victoria Newland actually testified to it. Yes, Marco Rubio asked her if there were labs there, and she said yes, but they were for, research, health problems and so on. So anyway, Elon Musk, who can, perhaps is the only person in the world who can afford the luxury of being taken to court. He said that USAID is a criminal organization. And so, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Musk. That's all for today. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.